At dawn on May 29th, 1453, Mehmed's monstrous bronze bombard cracked along its barrel and misfired, and the thousand-year siege of Constantinople failed in a single morning. The great cannon cast by Orban, the founder of Hungarian or Transylvanian origin, who had first offered his services to the Byzantines before selling them to the Sultan, had battered the Theodosian Walls for weeks. On this final morning, it was meant to widen the breach in the Mesotychion and let the Janissaries pour through. Instead, it split, and the killing gap in the ancient triple fortification was never opened. The defenders, perhaps 7,000 men against an army many times their number, held the line through the day. For decades, the Ottoman siege had seemed an unstoppable tide. It had begun on April 6, 1453, under a sultan barely 21 years old, against a city already a hollow shell of its former empire. Constantine XI Palaiologos, last of the Palaiologos dynasty, commanded walls that had turned away every assault for 1,000 years, but could no longer be fully manned. The Genoese captain Giovanni Giustiniani Longo led much of the land defense, and when he fell wounded that morning, as he had in our own history, the line wavered. But this time the wall behind him held, and the wavering did not become a rout. In this alternate timeline exploration, we examine what could have happened and why the real history unfolded differently. For what no one in that smoke-choked dawn could have known was that the failure of a single cannon would bend the course of three civilizations. The consequences would not surface for decades. They would reshape an empire, a faith, and a renaissance. 3 days later, the sails appeared from the north. A combined Venetian and Genoese relief squadron, long promised and slow to assemble, forced the Bosporus and bore down on the mouth of the Golden Horn. In the true history, this fleet arrived too late and turned back. Here, delayed only by days, it arrived to find the city still standing, and that changed everything. The great chain the defenders had stretched across the Horn to bar the Ottoman fleet had held the surface waters, but Mehmed had outflanked it, hauling his ships overland on greased rollers from the Bosporus into the harbor. Now those beached and vulnerable vessels lay exposed to the heavy Italian galleys. The relief squadron broke the Ottoman hold on the Horn in an afternoon of fire and ramming. Grain and powder and fresh men flowed into the starving city. The blockade that had sealed Constantinople for 50 days was severed. Halil Pasha, the Grand Vizier who had counseled against this war from the beginning, watched the smoke rise over the water and understood what it meant. The young sultan had gambled the prestige of his house on a wall that would not break. Now the sea belonged to the Christians again. A fed city, a hostile fleet, and a restless camp left Mehmed no good choices. His army had been promised the richest plunder in Christendom and had instead spent itself against stone. Disease moved through the siege lines. The Anatolian levies grumbled. To press on now risked a mutiny that could cost him his throne. In the second week of June, the Sultan ordered the great camp struck and withdrew toward Edirne. The cannon that had failed him dragged sullenly behind. The retreat was not a catastrophe, but it was a humiliation, and humiliation at that court had teeth. Halil Pasha's caution had been vindicated before the whole army. The faction that had warned against the war, the older statesmen who preferred consolidation to conquest, found their voices suddenly loud again. Mehmed kept his throne, but he had spent the easy authority of a conqueror before he had earned it. For years to come, every bold venture he proposed would meet the quiet question, and what of Constantinople? The boy who would have been called the conqueror became, instead, the sultan who turned back. What Constantine saved was not an empire, but a fragment. The surviving state amounted to little more than the city itself, and a thin grip on the straits, a capital without a hinterland, a throne propped on borrowed money and foreign ships. The emperor governed from a Hagia Sophia whose mosaics were cracked and whose treasury was empty. Survival had a price, and it was paid in privileges. Venice and Genoa, whose fleet had broken the siege, did not act from charity. They took customs concessions, trading quarters, and the right to tax the very commerce that flowed past the walls they had saved. Lucas Notaras, the Mehmed II and senior surviving official, became the man who managed this slow mortgaging of independence. He negotiated with Italian creditors, balanced the demands of Venice against those of Genoa across the Horn in Galata, and kept the reduced state solvent through arrangements that wounded Greek pride at every turn. The city lived, but it lived as a client, a fortified toll gate on the Bosporus, valuable to its protectors precisely because it controlled the water between two seas. It was a diminished thing. It was also, against every expectation, still there. Blocked at the Bosporus, Ottoman ambition did not vanish. It turned inland, denied the imperial city that would have crowned their power and anchored their logistics. Mehmed's successors pressed their expansion by the slow land routes through Serbia and Bosnia and toward the Danube. The conquests came, but they came harder. Without Constantinople as a capital and arsenal astride the straits, the Ottomans lacked the central prestige that in our history drew vassals and terrified rivals into submission. Each Balkan campaign had to be argued for, supplied overland, and won against defenders who no longer believed Ottoman victory was written in the stars. This mattered far beyond the Balkans. The fall of Constantinople had been, in the real history, a thunderclap that announced a new great power to a frightened Europe. Its absence meant the Christian kingdoms to the west, Hungary, the Habsburg lands, Venice's mainland holdings faced a slower, more contested advance, with time to fortify and to coordinate. The Ottoman state remained formidable, but it grew as one power among several, rather than as the inevitable empire of the age. And then came a quieter consequence, far from any battlefield, that would shape the mind of Europe itself. For decades, Greek scholars had carried the classical inheritance westward, manuscripts of Plato and Aristotle, and the lost mathematics of antiquity flowing into the libraries of Florence and Venice. In our history, the fall of the city turned that stream into a flood of refugees, a one-time exodus of learned men fleeing with whatever they could rescue. Here, with the city standing, the flow did not break and scatter. It became something steadier and, in the end, more powerful, an ongoing exchange rather than a final flight. Constantinople survived as a living source rather than a plundered ruin. Its scholars traveled to Italy to teach and returned to copy and recover more. Italian students came east to learn Greek, where Greek was still spoken in the shadow of Hagia Sophia. Copyists worked both ends of the road. The Renaissance still drank deeply from the classical past, but it drank from a well that had not run dry, fed by a city that remained a workshop of the old learning rather than its grave. The transmission that historically came as a tragic rescue came instead as a long collaboration. The West gained not only the manuscripts but the men, again and again, for generations. Survival could not heal the wound inside the church. In December 1452, with the Ottoman army gathering, a union of the Catholic and Orthodox faiths had been proclaimed beneath the dome of Hagia Sophia, Cardinal Isidore of Kiev presiding, the price demanded by the West for its aid. The people of the city had loathed it then, and they loathed it still. Many had whispered they would sooner see the Sultan's turban than the Cardinal's hat. Now the empire that survived owed its survival to those Catholic fleets and Catholic loans, and still its people would not accept Rome. The union frayed under that pressure rather than dissolving the city's faith. Constantine leaned on the Latin powers for ships and silver, while Orthodox resistance hardened in the streets and monasteries. Yet because the city endured, the Orthodox world kept its ancient center on the Bosporus. In our history, with Constantinople gone, the mantle of Orthodox leadership passed north to Moscow, which proclaimed itself the Third Rome. Here that claim never takes root the same way. Eastern Christianity retains a stronger, independent heart at its old source, and the spiritual map of Eastern Europe is drawn along very different lines, less Russian, more Greek, and never wholly Rome's. It was never a triumph. The Byzantine state that endured past 1453 was a reduced and dependent thing, a Christian foothold clinging to the straits, paying for each decade of life in concessions and compromise. There was no glorious resurrection, no reconquest of lost provinces, no revenge upon the Ottomans who ringed its shrunken borders. Constantine rebuilt nothing grand. He preserved a remnant, and his successors preserved it after him, by the unglamorous arts of debt, diplomacy, and the careful playing of one great power against another. And yet that remnant changed the world by simply refusing to die. A surviving Constantinople meant an Ottoman Empire that never quite became the imperial colossus astride east and west. It meant an orthodox center that never wholly passed to Moscow, a renaissance fed by a living tradition rather than a dying one, and a balance of power between the Ottoman, Habsburg, and Russian worlds that tilted along unfamiliar lines for centuries to come. The walls held for one more day. A single cannon cracked instead of a city. In the real history, the bombard fired true, the walls fell, and an age ended on the 29th of May. The smallest accident of bronze and powder was all that separated the world we know from one in which Byzantium, against every expectation, simply went on.